From today's reading from the letter to the Ephesians, be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time, because the days are evil. What an epigraph that would make for a book called, say, Human History. When haven't the days been evil? When hasn't some form of wisdom been necessary to get through a lifetime fraught with pitfalls and dangers, both in the world at large and within our own soul? Make the most of the time. That's about the safest phrase in this passage, and maybe the one where we focus most of our energy each day. Make the most of it. It ain't gonna last. The days are evil. Be careful. I find myself thinking about the people of Afghanistan a lot these days. I don't know much about that country or its customs, but when I think of the Taliban rapidly retaking cities as it has been, that rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouching towards Kabul to be reborn, I shudder. I cannot imagine what it must feel like to live there, to know that this repressive, murderous cult is headed my way, that my freedom and safety will soon depend on the whim of monsters. Make the most of the time, because the days are evil. Years ago I read, like many, The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and I got a sliver of a sense of what life was like pre-Taliban and then post in the book. That was fiction, but we've heard enough news stories to know it's based in fact. I pray every day for the people of Afghanistan, for the girls and the women especially, even as I feel frustration at what we've done and left undone there. I am no military tactician, nor can I pretend to be a political genius, so I have no idea what the best course would be in this mess, when what feels like implacable evil dominates a part of the world. And now the Taliban has access to the billions worth of weaponry we left for the government's armed forces to defend themselves. Of course, for most of us, life isn't nearly so bad. We have enough resources to live, an abundance compared with most others in this world. Along with that, some of us have found love, or have a good job, or have friends and community, or can travel when the time comes. We are not visited too often individually by what the Bible would consider evil days. The hardest thing most of us go through, and it is hard, is losing a loved one, or living with failing health, or the failing health of a loved one. And yet I must admit, despite all this abundance, I have been a little bummed these days. And, just to cheer you up some more, climate change is another disaster on my mind. This one slouching rapidly towards us all, a many-headed monster in large part of our own making. I commute 90 minutes, 5 days a week in my Mazda 3, contributing my own pollution to the mix. I buy stuff from Amazon, Trader Joe's, Costco, and all that packaging is choking dolphins somewhere out in the ocean. I love burgers and steak. William and I concur, we can't do much on our own. The edict has to come from governments and leaders, which is true. But don't we have a moral responsibility, regardless of its impact, to not behave as if nothing we do matters? I love the convenience of my life. Love that I'm finally in a place where I don't have to worry so much about my financial or emotional needs being met. As far as changing any of my behaviors goes, a part of me would frankly prefer to remain blissfully ignorant of the world's problems, even as I read the news each day and shake my head in dismay and sorrow. Fires, smoke, floods, earthquakes, armies, killings, racism, all on my iPhone, so close to my eyes, yet so far from my conscience. And I know I'm not alone in this behavior pattern. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. Today's reading from the first book of Kings is carefully curated so that we hear only an earnest request from Solomon for wisdom. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people. That's in chapter 3. What we don't get in our reading is most of chapter 2, where Solomon, after King David's death, is settling his father's scores, killing his opponents, and carving out power so that he can rule. To some extent, this is necessary in order for Solomon to have a peaceful reign. But it's a sort of background story we don't really like to hear about in church. Solomon is indeed granted wisdom and power and wealth. In fact, he constructs the great first temple at Jerusalem, placing the Ark of the Covenant there and making it the central place of worship for all the people of Israel and Judah. At the same time, he makes political deals with the nations surrounding him, taking wives from those nations so as to solidify relations with them. As a result, he allows for the construction of hill shrines to the pagan gods his new wives worship. Then at a certain point, he himself goes up to offer worship at those shrines. Even someone as wise as Solomon messes it up. Note that in today's reading from Kings near the end, God does say to Solomon, "If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your life." So that's chapter 3. Well, by chapter 11 of Kings, which we also won't hear in church, God is fed up. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of your father David, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. I will not, however, tear away the entire kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son, for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Now, believe it or not, I am not trying to bum you out on this beautiful August morning. But Afghanistan, climate change, our own complacency, these are real problems. And if even a wise man like Solomon can slide into sin at the siren song of this world's privileges, how can we expect to do God's will and walk in God's ways? The only way I know is found in today's gospel reading. Jesus says, "I am the living bread. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them." We have to constantly remember to look for Jesus, to look to Jesus for guidance. Yes, it's a terrible cliche, but there is truth to the phrase, what would Jesus do? We can't solve climate change on our own. Perhaps we can't win an unwinnable war in foreign lands, and we can't fix much of anything on our own. But we can choose to make ourselves just uncomfortable enough that we keep ourselves from sliding into utter complacency. What would Jesus have me do in this instance? Or in this one? Or in this one? It's a question it might do our soul well to ask at least once a day when the occasions arise. We come to church to be spiritually recharged for the week ahead. At least that's one important reason for attending. We receive the body and blood of Christ for strength to combat the week's challenges ahead. Church is not just ritual. This is not just community. We make contact with the divine here. We take it into ourselves and then go out into life to expend it. We become Christ. We follow his example as best we can. We worship his divinity through our own actions. Be careful then how you live. Not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil. I actually toyed with the idea of printing up strips of paper with that sentence from Ephesians for you to tape to your bathroom mirror for review each day. I was going to cut them up, and then I realized they're not going to do that. But what would it really mean in your life to live as a wise person? Think about it. What little daily, weekly choices could you make that will edge you back towards righteousness in God's eyes? We are not going to solve the world's problems by doing this. We may not even solve much of anything. But it matters how we choose to live. It matters what example we set for others. It matters that we show care for those in harm's way. It matters that we stop being prideful and start being more humble. It matters because the days are evil. And we've got to start being more careful then how we live. We don't have much time. Let us make the most of it. Today, August 15th, is the feast of St. Mary the Virgin. Yesterday, we commemorated Jonathan Daniels, the young white seminarian from New Hampshire who was murdered in 1965 when he went down to Alabama to help register black voters. In his diary, he writes of a conversion experience grounded in the words of St. Mary's Magnificat, which, when he sung them at evening prayer one day, filled him with conviction. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things. On the 14th of August, 1965, Daniels and 3 others were arrested for their organizing efforts in a small Alabama town. Released 6 days later, they walked to a local general store where they were confronted by a man with a shotgun. When he aimed it at Ruby Sales, a teenaged black girl in the group, Jonathan Daniels pushed her out of the way and took a bullet in the chest that killed him instantly. For Ruby Sales, already a young organizer, that moment was a turning point. The fact that he saved my life intensified my passion for freedom. But I didn't carry his death as a burden of guilt or as a weight. I carried it as a commitment. Nor did it make me bitter, because how could I be bitter in the midst of such generosity with someone who saved my life? She has spent the rest of her life fighting for racial equality and justice. Jesus took a bullet for you. How are you going to spend the rest of your life? Be careful then how you live. Not as unwise people, but as wise. Making the most of the time. Because the days are evil.